Thank you all for being here. Let's begin. Paul, share with us how you might teach Declaration 2.
Right. Thank you. So I'm going to try to just walk us through what my approach would be. And I'm starting by just simply pasting in what Come Follow Me offers for teachers if they were to approach this topic. So you can see here, this is the section on Official Declaration 2. It's combined with the Articles of Faith and Official Declaration 1. So that's a lot to tackle for anyone. And this is going to focus on how we might approach Official Declaration 2. The first sentence in the paragraph, I can trust in the Lord even when I do not have a perfect understanding. I think that's a principle of faith for everyone, regardless of the topic. The next sentence, we don't know why priesthood ordination and temple ordinances were not available to church members of African descent for a time. That sentence, as a historian, doesn't sit quite well with me. And so the focus of this presentation is on what we do know. And I, in approaching this topic, would simply start by finding out where my class was on the topic. Meaning, where are members of my class? What's the baseline? I do this when I teach, for example, polygamy in my Utah history class at the University of Utah. I want to know, hey, what have you heard as to why Latter-day Saints practice polygamy? And I get it all out there, so I have a baseline. So I'm interested. What the people on the panel, what have you heard as the reasons for the racial restrictions? And I know this is a well-educated group on this topic. I'm interested in what was floating around in your mind or had you heard in Latter-day Saint culture before you came to study it out and learn things for yourself. Just the reasons that exist.
I'll go.
Yeah. Ramesses.
When I found out that Black members previously didn't hold the priesthood until 1978, I actually learned that from someone I was dating who shared anti-Mormon literature with me as a way to get me to turn my back to the church. When I asked some of my leaders that I felt comfortable would be honest with me, they all said they didn't know. Now, when I started digging in and started learning more for myself, some of the common themes were Black members were fence sitters, or they weren't as valiant in their pre-existence, or the curse of Cain / the curse of Ham. And so those are some of the things that, as I began digging in, that I heard, but prior to that, I'd never heard it, and I didn't even know that it existed.
Right. Thank you. Anyone else?
So when I became a member, it wasn't even discussed. I didn't even know until years later that there was a restriction. As a matter of fact, somebody outside the church said, "How could you be a member of a church that just gave the priesthood in 1978?" And I'm like, "What?" And then when I did hear about it, it was because they said it was because of the curse of Cain. And I'm like, well, that's poppycock. So it was kind of unbelievable. Okay. And as I read, let's talk about race in the priesthood and Matthew Harris, and it's just like, oh my lands. Did Satan have a real foothold like that? You know? So when I became a member, it wasn't even addressed. Maybe I was a female and I didn't need to know. I don't know. But I had no clue.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Anyone else?
I'll go. And similarly, right? I grew up in the church, but it wasn't. It was somewhat talked about, and I grew up in Brazil, and it was somewhat talked about because my very first bishop, so I was about 2 or 3 years old. he um, he was a member prior to 1978 and received the priesthood in 1978. Obviously, it was a black, and he was a bishop. And then he was called on to be the first black general authority, um, uh, uh, Elder Martins. Uh, so it was sort of a moment of for us, at least my ward, my little ward in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. It was almost like a sense of pride where we felt like, man, this is, he came right from right here, but it wasn't talked about in detail. It wasn't until my mission in New York City where I bumped into a couple of people where they had issues, and I had to learn for myself, right, and to sort of try to get some details. Unfortunately, even within some LDS authors, right? There's some misconceptions and I think a lack of understanding that I ended up being more confused during my mission a little bit, right? So I sort of put that on the side, and in recent years, I've tried to be a little bit more knowledgeable, on historically what really happened. So.
Yeah, thank you. So I appreciate this feedback. It gives us a sense of, first of all, just a lack of information. And then when there is information, sometimes like Stephanie and Ramesses pointed out, right, it's information that has been disavowed. But we haven't replaced that disavowed information with accurate information. And hopefully that's something we can accomplish with this presentation. And I want to just note that everything that I'm sharing is contained in Let's Talk About Race and Priesthood. So I know that sometimes people get leery about outside sources or what's sort of the source of the information. And nothing that I present goes beyond what's in Let's Talk About Race and Priesthood, which Deseret Book asked me to write. And after a very rigorous approval process, published in 2023. So, it went through Deseret Books' editorial approval process and a very protracted process. And so the information is contained in that book, and I'll be drawing from information in that book for the presentation, and then make a PDF of the slides available if it's useful for anyone who's looking for information to approach this topic. So I like to frame any discussion of difficult church history by something that Elder Stephen Snow said when he was church historian for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. He said, "My view is that being open about our history solves a whole lot more problems than it creates." That's a philosophy that I subscribe to, and that's a philosophy that I will adopt in this presentation. I think just our opening examples of lack of information, right, leads to speculation and it leads to more challenges than being open and honest. So that's one framing principle that we'll use in the presentation. And then a second framing principle is articulated by President Dallin H. Oaks when he was a member of the first presidency. He said, "As citizens and as members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, we must do better to help root out racism." In my estimation, as a historian, it's impossible to root out racism without a willingness to examine its roots. We have to look at what it looked like among us as Latter-day Saints. If we only conceive of rooting out racism as a problem that exists out there in society, we're missing the real work that we are being called on to engage in, and that's amongst us as Latter-day Saints. And then the last framing principle is articulated by President Nelson in his talk, "Let God Prevail." He articulated what I understand as an eternal principle. said, God does not love one race more than another. I assure you that your standing before God is not determined by the color of your skin. Favor or disfavor with God is dependent upon your devotion to God and his commandments and not the color of your skin. I think, once again, a profound eternal principle. And yet, in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, we spent roughly 130 years doing the exact opposite. Rather than someone standing before God being based upon their devotion to God, decisions were made based upon the color of their skin. So that's the difficult history. And that's what I think it's important for us to understand. So when Deseret Book approached me to write Let's Talk About Race and Priesthood, I said, I know what I want the structure to be. And, if this project's going to go forward, it's going to need to be framed this way if I'm going to be involved with it. And they were fully on board. And the book is structured in this way. And this is just if Latter-day Saints were able to at least appreciate this history in these three phases, I think it might even help us to take a step forward, just understanding that the first phase was open priesthood and temples. The racial restrictions, in other words, were not in place from the beginning. There is no evidence, and you can read the Race and the Priesthood essay, which was approved by the First Presidency and the Quorum of the 12. It reiterates there is no evidence that traces the racial restrictions to Joseph Smith. First couple of decades, open priesthood and temples. Then the next phase, beginning under Brigham Young, he first openly articulates or publicly articulates a racial restriction, even though he's privately articulated one as early as 1849. He's publicly articulating one by 1852. But it's not firmly in place at his first utterance. So it takes on a life of its own, and I think firmly solidified by 1908 under Joseph F. Smith. So open priesthood and temples are replaced by segregated priesthood and temples. And then in June of 1978, President Spencer W. Kimball announces what becomes known as Official Declaration 2, the reason for this lesson. And in my estimation, that is simply a return to racial inclusivity. It restores the church to its founding principles of inclusion and rectifies the church to the scriptures of the Restoration. So just understanding those three phases can be helpful in how to approach this difficult history. So we're going to start, and then the rest of the presentation is just offering evidence to support these three phases. So you might have skeptics in your class. And I think it's just important to say, okay, look, we're going to lay this out in these three phases, and I've just picked some slices of evidence for each of the three phases to support the assertion that this is how it played out over time. In historical documents, we do know, right? We do have evidence that can support the way that this plays out across time. And like I said, I'm just picking some slices of evidence. The Let's Talk About Race and Priesthood book has a lot more than what we can present, in a Sunday school lesson. So phase one is members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints created an inclusive vision. Joseph Smith claims 5 revelations that are included in the Doctrine and Covenants, our topic of study for this year in Come Follow Me. Before I wrote Let's Talk About Race and Priesthood, I read the Doctrine and Covenants and intentionally read it racially. And I came away more convinced than ever that the founding decades are characterized by open priesthood and temples and racial inclusiveness. So I've asked, the people on the panel, let's just read these 5 different revelations. So DNC 5864.
Early, the sound must go forth from this place unto all the world and unto the utmost parts of the earth. The gospel must be preached unto every creature, with signs following them that believe.
Go ye into all the world, preach the gospel to every creature, acting in the authority which I have given you, baptizing in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Ghost.
Verily,
Amen.
thus saith the Lord unto you, my servant Stephen Burnett. Go ye into the world, and preach the gospel to every creature that cometh under the sound of your voice.
Therefore, go ye into all the world, and unto whatsoever place ye cannot go, ye shall send, that the testimony may go forth, may go from you into all the world unto every creature.
But purify your hearts before me, and then go ye into all the world, and preach my gospel unto every creature who has not received it.
What's the common theme?
The gospel was supposed to go to everyone.
Who's left out?
Nobody.
Sometimes I hear Latter-day Saints suggest that they try to justify or explain away the racial restrictions by suggesting, Jews first, then Gentiles, as a parallel to white people first, then Black people. What we just read were 5 revelations to Joseph Smith. A lot of times as Latter-day Saints, we like to say unto every nation, kindred, tongue, and people. 5 revelations say unto every creature. There is no wiggle room. The gospel was meant for everyone. It's a command 5 different times to take the gospel to every creature. There's just no wiggle room at all. This is the universalism bound up in our scriptures. Let's look at DNC 38:16.
And for your salvation I give unto you a commandment, for I have heard your prayers, and the poor have complained before me, and the rich I have made, and all flesh is mine, and I am no respecter of persons.
What do you think Jesus means? This is first person voice. All flesh is mine.
He claims everyone. He claims all of us, and he hears all of us.
Yeah, so what color of flesh does Jesus Christ not claim as his own? He is, once again, articulating universalism, right? Everyone is his child. He's claiming all flesh as his own. And in first person voice, he's declaring himself as no respecter of persons. If we lay the racial priesthood restrictions at his feet, what are the implications? Everyone is equal in his eyes, and to suggest that somehow he is the source of this seems to violate the very thing he's declaring himself to be, no respecter of persons. Okay, so that's just a couple of pieces of evidence. I like to show this as another piece of evidence because people say, well, what about the temple? Black people weren't allowed in the temple. And we have this message from the first presidency that was published in the Times and Seasons newspaper in October of 1840 in Nauvoo. And the first presidency is exuberant about the nature of the gospel gathering that has taken place up to this point. And so they publish this article as they imagine the gospel message spreading around the world and those who might gather to Nauvoo, Illinois. Yet the work roll forth with the same rapidity as it is heretofore done, we may soon expect to see flocking to this place people from every land and from every nation. The polished European, the degraded Hottentot. Hottentot is a 19th century term used to apply to tribal South Africans specifically, or tribal Africans generally. They are imagining them gathering to Nauvoo, Illinois, and the shivering Laplander, persons of all languages and of every tongue and of every color, who shall with us worship the Lord of hosts in his holy temple and offer up their orisons in his sanctuary. Talking about who will be invited to worship in the temple that they will begin to build that following spring. Just another piece of evidence for the inclusive vision in the first couple of decades of the faith. And we can go all the way to March of 1847 under Brigham Young, where this inclusive vision continues. There's a Black Latter-day Saint named William McCary who complains to Brigham Young and other Latter-day Saint leaders at winter quarters that he's experiencing racism at the hands of his fellow Latter-day Saints. And I think the evidence is that he was experiencing racism. So he makes an appeal to Brigham Young, and Brigham Young responds by trying to reassure him that everyone is a part of God's human family. It has nothing to do with the blood, for of one blood has God made all flesh. We're all part of the same big family. He's paraphrasing Acts 17:26. And then McCary complains, well, look, I don't have priesthood authority. And Brigham Young says, look, we don't discriminate in distributing priesthood authority. And he cites Q. Walker Lewis, who has been ordained an elder by William Smith, Joseph Smith's younger brother, in the Low Massachusetts branch, as evidence that we don't discriminate in distributing priesthood authority. We have one of the best elders, an African in Lowell, a barber. It matches perfectly what we know about Q. Walker Lewis. He's a barber by trade. He's in the Low Massachusetts branch. He's an ordained elder. And we also know he's an abolitionist. He paid a generous tithing, and he would host missionaries in his home to spread the gospel message. And when McCary persisted, Brigham Young tried to reassure him again, look, we don't care about the color. So that's just additional evidence, right, even with Brigham Young in March of 1847 about this racial vision. And then we could look at how Latter-day Saints actually applied this open vision. They ordained Black men to the priesthood in the North, and they converted enslaved people in the South to the Latter-day Saint gospel. Unto every creature, they took that seriously. The most well-documented Black priesthood holder in the 19th century church is Elijah Abel, and he's ordained in January of 1836 as an elder. Joseph Smith signed his ministerial certificate a couple of months later, and that's indicating his approval of that ordination. He receives his washing and anointing rituals in the Kirtland Temple later that year, and then by December is ordained a member of the Third Quorum of the 70, which is a missionary quorum in the 19th century, not a general authority quorum as reconstituted in the 20th century. But nonetheless, he will spend the rest of his life as a member of that Third Quorum of the 70 and serve 3 missions for the Latter-day Saint faith. Other evidence of racial inclusion. Jane Manning James and her entire family convert in Connecticut. And her brother, Isaac Lewis Manning, baptized in December 1842, will pay a 25-cent tithing in May of 1843. And then with Jane and the rest of the family migrate to Nauvoo. Jane becomes a servant in the Nauvoo mansion house and Joseph and Emma's house, and Isaac becomes the cook. He will later recall, I was cook in the prophet's kitchen at Nauvoo, and he used to say I was a mighty good cook too. I cooked the prophet's meals when I was servant in the family. He became a drummer in the Nauvoo Legion. He donated to the building of the Nauvoo Temple. And what became his badge of honor, and the painting here is by Marlena Wilding. She's a Black Latter-day Saint artist, graduated from BYU, and she depicts Isaac with a shovel and in one hand and an affidavit in another hand. In 1903, he signs out he swears out an affidavit that he dug the graves. He is the person who dug 4 graves for the slain bodies of Joseph and Hiram Smith. 2 graves in the Nauvoo Cemetery, where caskets filled with sand were buried. because the saints were worried those who had murdered Joseph and Hiram would dig up the bodies and desecrate them. And then Isaac dug 2 more graves at the Joseph and Emma homestead location where the bodies were actually laid to rest. And that was his service to Joseph and Hiram, his badge of honor. And he carried that with him for the rest of his life, so much so that he wanted that affidavit, which is in the church history department's archives, where I found it. And he also told a fellow Latter-day Saint that he knew Brother Joseph was a man of God and he would have laid down his life for the prophet if he could have done so. So it gives a sense of his devotion to the faith. And then as evidence of enslaved people, right, unto every creature, Samuel Chambers is converted in Mississippi in 1844. He's 13 years old. He's a one-person congregation. There's no one else for him to worship with, but he maintains a spark of faith for over 20 years. He will later recall, although in bondage for 20 years after receiving the gospel, yet I kept the faith. I was baptized in the year 1844, and after that I was 21 years in bondage, during which time I never heard a word of the gospel. The Spirit of God remained within me. In 1865, I was liberated. I then commenced to say means to gather. This took me 4 years. So at the end of the Civil War, he gains his freedom, saves up money, and with his wife and relatives, they migrate to Utah Territory and arrive in 1870. And he will become a member of the Salt Lake 8th Ward Deacons Quorum, even though he's not ordained a deacon. And he will, on occasion, bear testimony, and these are his words. I don't get tired of being with the Latter-day Saints, nor of being one of them. I'm glad that I ever took upon me the name of Christ. Some think it is small to be a deacon. I think there is nothing small in the kingdom of God. So that's evidence of the open racial vision in the first couple of decades of the faith. And Latter-day Saint missionaries took the command to preach unto every creature seriously. They're baptizing enslaved and free Black Latter-day Saints, as well as white enslavers. So you have white enslavers who are enslaving their fellow Black Latter-day Saints. And so things are going to start to change when that disparate group starts gathering to Utah Territory, a political entity without prior laws on the books regarding slavery. Latter-day Saints' open vision starts to deteriorate, and it's replaced then by segregated priesthood in temples, but that develops in fits and starts over time. So I think it's important for people to understand that outsiders looked in on that open racial vision and were shocked. They accused Latter-day Saints of being too accepting of the very dregs of society. So these are just examples of the accusations leveled against the Latter-day Saints in Missouri. One accusation leveled against them: Mormons honored the natural equality of mankind without accepting the Native Indians or the African race. These are not, praises of Mormon diversity. They're accusations that Mormons are accepting the very people that the rest of white society has segregated and even enslaved. Mormons opened an asylum for rogues and vagabonds and free Blacks is one accusation, and that they are accused in Missouri of actually promoting Black ascendancy over white people. They don't understand the right racial hierarchy, and they are too accepting of the people that the rest of society suggests should be segregated or enslaved. So the most significant way that you claim whiteness for yourself when you're accused of being too friendly with Black is in distance from Blackness. And that's what we see happening across the course of the rest of the 19th century as Latter-day Saints move in fits and starts away from that racial inclusive vision. And so in teaching this, I just sort of zeroed in on 4 moments. So once again, it doesn't just happen overnight. And I see 4 time periods that I would focus in on. And, depending on the time you have in a classroom, you might skip some of these, right? These are just moments where I see the racial restrictions beginning to formulate and develop over time. So we'll just touch on them really briefly. 1847. Remember, we had Brigham Young favorably aware of Black priesthood holder in March of 1847. In December of 1847, that same year, he learns about Enoch Lewis in the Lowell, Massachusetts branch, married to Mary Matilda Webster. So this is Kewalker Lewis's son, who's Black, and a Latter-day Saint, married to a white Latter-day Saint in the Lowell, Massachusetts branch. And William Appleby, who visited the branch, was disgusted by this, firmly against race mixing, and reports this to Brigham Young in December of 1847 at winter quarters. There are only 13 handwritten lines that survive from that meeting, but they are filled with concern over race mixing. And Brigham Young will first privately articulate the notion that capital punishment might be the penalty for race mixing. So we see him moving in a different direction, and concern over race mixing seems to be the catalyst for moving him in a different direction. The next moment that we can zero in on is 1852, and this is when Brigham Young will publicly first articulate a racial restriction, and it's in a debate with Orson Pratt over what laws will govern enslaved people in Utah Territory. Orson Pratt is arguing for a free soil ethic. He represents the free soil ethic that's sweeping in across the nation, and Brigham Young will look backward to unfree labor categories that he grew up with, indentured servitude and apprenticeships. And so there's a debate that takes place in this legislative session, and Orson Pratt wants the proposed legislation dismissed altogether. He argues that only God administers divine curses and that they are particular to a given time and place. So God may talk about a curse in the Old Testament, for example, and that's where it stays. It doesn't have anything to do with 1852 Utah Territory. So he's rejecting the curse of Ham, servant of servants, that's been used by Christians to justify enslaving Black people for several hundred years before the church is even founded. He says curses are not multi-generational. Shall we take then the innocent African that has committed no sin and damn him to slavery and bondage without receiving any authority from heaven to do so, is his question. He defines people of Black African ancestry, in other words, as innocent. Brigham Young will define them as inherently guilty and articulate the curse of Cain. So that goes back to the stories that Ramesses and Stephanie heard as an explanation for the racial restrictions. And that will be the explanation that Brigham Young actually gives. Orson Pratt finds, the notion that Utah should enslave or legalize enslavement preposterous. He says it's enough to cause the angels in heaven to blush. And he actually proposes that Black men be allowed to vote in 1852 Utah Territory. So why is this important? Because we have evidence. We have evidence. We have information for where the racial restrictions come from. And it's a very earthly debate in a territorial legislature that will prompt Brigham Young's first public articulation. So in response to Orson Pratt's articulation or proposal that Black men be allowed to vote, Brigham Young will say, we just as well make a bill here for mules to vote as Negroes or Indians. You cannot find within man upon the face of the earth who are the seed of Cain any that possess knowledge and sensibility enough to vote. Brigham Young will also say, what we're trying to do today is to make the Negro equal with us in all of our privileges, again, rejecting the notion of Black male voting rights. My voice shall be against it all the day long, he says. And in the very same speech, he will articulate this curse of Cain rationale for a priesthood restriction. If there never was a prophet or apostle of Jesus Christ spoken before, I tell you, this people that are commonly called Negroes are the children of Cain. I know they are. I know they cannot bear rule in the priesthood in the first sense of the word. And he will say that people of Black African ancestry are cursed descendants of Cain because Cain killed his brother Abel. All of Abel's descendants, who he presumes to be white people, will need to get the priesthood before any of Cain's descendants can receive the priesthood who he presumes to be Black people. It's a violation of the second article of faith. Joseph Smith said, we are held accountable for our own sins, not for Adam's transgression, and yet Brigham Young is holding the supposed descendants of Cain accountable for a murder in which they took no part. So Orson Pratt does not buy this, and in fact rejects Brigham Young's only rationale for the priesthood restriction. We have no proof that the Africans are the descendants of old Cain who was cursed, and even if we had that evidence, we have not been ordered to inflict that curse upon that race, is Orson Pratt's response. So once again, the context is earthly, and Orson Pratt rejects Brigham Young's only rationale for our priesthood restriction. So we do know, we do have evidence. We have speeches that are recorded and are found in the Church History Library archives. Hopefully it goes without saying that Orson Pratt is correct, that we have no proof that Africans are the descendants of old Cain. That's an idea that predated the founding of the faith for several hundred years. And Brigham Young brings it into the faith and gives it theological weight in 1852. Tragically, Pratt will then articulate in 1853 the notion, well, maybe Black people were less valiant or neutral in a pre-existence, and that's why they're born into Black skin. So the debate between these two men produced the two reasons that actually are given for the racial priesthood and temple restrictions all the way up into the 20th century. And you saw both Ramesses and Stephanie hearing those explanations, right? They kind of exist amongst us as Latter-day Saints. It's important to remember they have been disavowed by the First Presidency and the Quorum of the 12 Apostles. They are not valid. Okay, so the other moment then that we could focus in on is 1879, because Elijah Abel applies for to be sealed to his wife, who has predeceased him. She dies in 1877. She's another Black Latter-day Saint pioneer. And the leader of the faith, John Taylor, doesn't know what to do. So the point I'm trying to make, once again, if the racial restrictions are unambiguously in place when Brigham Young first utters them, then why would the leader of the faith, John Taylor, need to conduct an investigation? In fact, that's what he does. That's why 1879 is another important moment in the development of the restriction, because John Taylor conducts an investigation. And he sends Joseph F. Smith to interview Elijah Abel. And these are the notes of that interview in Joseph F. Smith's handwriting. And I think the most important part is Elijah Abel telling Joseph F. Smith that Joseph, meaning the prophet Joseph Smith, said he was entitled to the priesthood and all the blessings. John Taylor's conclusion from this investigation is that in the early days of the church, sometimes mistakes were made. So in his interpretation of this, someone made a mistake, and he's deciding that that mistake was Joseph Smith. And Brigham Young got it right when he said Black people should not hold the priesthood. He decides he will allow Elijah Abel's priesthood to stand, but not allow him into the temple to be sealed to his deceased wife. Remarkably, Elijah Abel will then be called on a third mission in 1883. And as a 75-year-old, he's sent back to Ohio, where he will serve until he returns and then passes away just 2 weeks after his return to Salt Lake on Christmas Day in 1884. Joseph F. Smith is the person who lays his hand on Elijah Abel's head and sets him apart for that third mission. So, John Taylor's interpretation, right? We're not going to violate the precedent that Brigham Young established, even though Brigham Young's precedent is a violation of Joseph Smith's open priesthood in times. So it starts to take on a life of its own and accumulate growing precedent across the course of the 19th century. So we get to the last brick in this wall, 1908, and I think the racial restrictions are firmly put in place under Joseph F. Smith. The first presidency, like the rest of the nation, will adopt a one-drop policy in 1907. The rest of the nation, after Plessy versus Ferguson, where the Supreme Court says you can segregate, and Homer Plessy, who's used in that court case, is 1/8 of African descent. So his ancestry is more white than black, but the Supreme Court says you can still legally segregate him. And that gives rise to what are called one-drop laws, meaning one drop of African ancestry. You can have 99 white ancestors and one black ancestor, and you can still be legally segregated in states that adopt one-drop policies. And the first presidency will adopt a one-drop policy in 1907 for priest ordination and temple admission. Fits into this bigger context where the rest of the nation is grappling with, hey, who can we legally segregate? How much African ancestry does a person have to be legally segregated? So the first presidency says the descendants of Ham may receive baptism and confirmation, but no one known to have in his vein Negro blood, it matters not how remote a degree, can either have the priesthood in any degree or the blessings of the temple, no matter how otherwise worthy he may be. And then the restrictions are solidified. And why I think this is the last brick in this wall of segregation is simply because Joseph F. Smith in 1908 creates a new memory moving forward. And that memory then will become the memory for the church in the 20th century. And we have, 5 data points for Joseph F. Smith. We can see what happens to his memory over time. In 1879, he defended Abel's priesthood as valid because he interviewed Elijah Abel in person. In 1883, he sets Elijah Abel apart for that mission. In 1895, he reminded LDS leaders that Abel was ordained to the priesthood at Kirtland under the direction of the prophet Joseph Smith. Then the slippage starts. In 1904, he called Abel's ordination a mistake that was never corrected. And in 1908, he claimed that Abel's priesthood ordination had been declared null and void by the prophet himself. So the new memory for the 20th century becomes the racial restrictions were always in place. Human beings had nothing to do with it. God put them in place, and it will take a revelation to get rid of. And in fact, it does 70 years later take a revelation to get rid of. At the same meeting in 1908, Joseph F. Smith says that missionaries should not take the initiative in proselyting among the Negro people. But if Negroes or people tainted with Negro blood apply for baptism themselves, they might be admitted to church membership in the understanding that nothing further can be done for them. We started by reading 5 revelations unto every creature. By 1908, the leadership is saying stop proselyting in black neighborhoods. So you see change over time and the violation of the scriptural mandates that we started by reading. And it's us to understand why the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints becomes known as a white church in the 20th century, because leaders made deliberate decisions. So accused of being too accepting in Missouri, rogues and vagabonds and free blacks. And by 1908, one way you find acceptance is to exclude black people. And the leader of the faith decides that missionaries should stop actively preaching amongst black people. Okay, so then that just gets us, obviously skipping a lot, and we jump then to June of 1978, and that is the return to racial inclusivity. That restores the faith to its founding universalism and rectifies it to the scriptures of the Restoration. And I like to just close with the example of Frida Lucretia McGee Ballou, because we often talk about a priesthood restriction, but we have to remember that Black men and women were also barred from the temple. Frida is baptized in a creek outside of Tylertown, Mississippi in June of 1909 with her entire family. She grows up in a Black Latter-day Saint family outside of Tylertown, Mississippi. She recalls, "We always had prayer morning and night and scripture study before going to bed. Once in a while, missionaries would come by and spend time teaching us more about the gospel. My parents taught us the principle of tithing. When my father was teaching school, our tithing was sent in regularly to Darwin, which is where the branch office was located." And she actually had a profound faith in tithing. At 25, she married Robert H. May Jr., but she described it as a very unhappy marriage. He didn't allow her to attend worship services. She says he didn't like Latter-day Saints. Nonetheless, she continued her private scripture study and prayers, and anytime she got a little money, she put a portion away in her trunk for tithing. When her husband's children were old enough to take care of themselves, she divorced him and moved back in with her family. And she said, "The money I had been saving in my trunk all those years was joyfully turned into the church as her tithing." Imagine her faith. She eventually will move to New Orleans. She'll meet and marry the love of her life, Rudolph Ballou. In 1944, she falls sick in bed. She doesn't know that there's a branch of the church meeting in New Orleans. She sends a letter to the mission office in Atlanta asking for missionaries to come and give her a blessing. In the meantime, Rudolph finds the branch president in New Orleans, and he shows up with the partner, not aware that there's a Black Latter-day Saint in New Orleans. They're in a Black neighborhood, not sure they're in the right location. They see the Liahona, which is a Southern States Mission newsletter, on her nightstand and realize they must be in the right place. They are both so taken by the experience and the faith that existed in her home that they both write it down. One of them sends it into the church news. The faith which led Sister Ballou to write to Atlanta and wait patiently through her suffering until those bearing the priesthood could reach her and give her a blessing was such as I had not witnessed in all my experience. I was astonished at my own confidence in the blessing that I pronounced upon her head. They checked back with her 2 days later, and she said, "Got out of bed the next day, and I've been feeling fine ever since." She then knew that she had a branch to worship in and worshiped in the New Orleans branch and then ward for the rest of her life. She gave a talk in state conference in 1982, and in that talk, she described July 21st, 1978 as the happiest day of her life. On that day, she had traveled 1,000 miles to the Washington, D.C. temple to be sealed by proxy to the love of her life, Rudolph Ballou, who had predeceased her. And that branch president who had found her sick in bed in 1944 stands in as proxy for Rudolph in that ceremony. Frida waited 69 years and 23 days from her baptism to be allowed to enter a Latter-day Saint temple. I want to remind us of what President Nelson said. Your standing before God is not based upon the color of your skin, but upon your devotion to God. Before June of 1978, Frida could answer the temple recommend questions exactly the same as a white person, and the white person admitted to the temple and Frida denied. Not based on her devotion to God, but based on the color of her skin. So this is why this is heavy history. And I would just like people to stop and consider what kind of Zion can we create and how do we learn from this difficult history and move forward doing better, rooting out racism. I like to conclude with Samuel Chambers' witness. The gospel is not only to the Gentiles, but also to the African. For I am of that race. The knowledge I received is from God. I pray that we may be as one to build up the kingdom of God. And Samuel Chambers' prayer is my prayer as well. And I think it's also helpful to give people a way to process and think through this. And I like to use Moroni Mormon 9:31, where Moroni is speaking, and he's saying, look, my father and I have imperfections. We're both prophets. We have imperfections. Don't condemn us because of our imperfections, but give thanks to God that he's made manifest unto you our imperfections, that ye may learn to be more wise than we have been. And it's wise counsel that is applicable, I think, to the racial restrictions. How can we learn to be more wise on race and inclusion than what our history bears out? So that's the basic outline of how I would present this. And I have lots of thought questions I'd love to engage people with. But I'd like to start by, after we go through that, what is wrong with saying, after we've gone through what we've just gone through, then what is the challenge of saying we don't know? How does that sit with people on the panel? Craig, you're in an interfaith group. If you're to say to people from Black churches in your interfaith group, hey, our church doesn't know where its racial restrictions come from, like, what kind of reaction are we going to get if that's the position that we take? And after going through at least a brief history, what response do we have from the panel as to this as a way to approach it?
Yeah, I feel like if we say that we just don't know, that leaves us in a challenging interfaith position where when we are willing to talk about the history and talk about what we are doing today, I think that opens hearts and builds bridges.
Yeah, thank you. Bruno or Ramesses, do you have thoughts?
I think if we don't share or we don't look for the reasons, it can sound sometimes like we're hiding something. And so I think the more knowledge and with the background understanding and the insightful, right, understanding of what was going on at the time, I think it's helpful to share that with others. So,
Yeah, thank you.
Kind of along the same lines. By saying that we don't know, it's not taking ownership of our past. And, Paul, you and I have had this discussion, and we think and feel the same way. And one of the things that we had discussed was our church is built on repentance and the atonement. And by saying we don't know, it's like me being before the bishop knowing that I've sinned, and me to say, well, I don't know. I don't think that I did anything wrong. How can I have true and sincere repentance and have a broken heart and contrite spirit if I don't acknowledge what I've done? And I think in order for the church to heal and move forward, it's to acknowledge that what happened by giving the apology and then allowing people to sit with it, to work through it, to go back and remember what is it that you truly believe, and then move forward. But I think as long as we play, no pun intended, we play the fence sitter game, you're not allowing people to heal. You're not allowing people to accept the truth. Because I've been in conversations with people as recently as 2 or 3 months ago who still believe in their hearts that the priesthood restriction and temple ban was of God. And I always loved your presentation bringing up the sister from New Orleans, because I think that is what gets missed. What gets missed severely is that Black women were not allowed to go to the temple to take out their endowments. And I mentioned to someone a couple of weeks ago that for a church that is based on forever families, the temple restriction for Black members dissolved Black families. That legacy that they could have had within the gospel. I've had the chance to talk with members of Green Flake's family, and I think where they could be if Green could have gone to the temple and been sealed with his family. And that's the thing that I think we need to really take a look at is our church is big on legacy. And when we look at our leaders, a lot of them can trace their lineage to the pioneers. There's a whole lot of Black people who were pioneers whose legacies have been eradicated because they weren't allowed to go to the temple and be sealed together as families for forever.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for sharing. So when I was second counselor in the young men's presidency in my congregation, we had a lesson on the attributes of God, and the lesson manual said, God is no respecter of persons. We read Jesus Christ declaring himself no respecter of persons in D&C 38:16. And I had a deacon who sat and pondered that for a minute and then raised his hand and said, if God is no respecter of persons, then why did he curse Black people with black skin? That's a 12-year-old in 2010. Right? Those kind of understandings being passed to the next generation. So why is it important for us to be open and honest about our racial past? We are going to continue to sit in this kind of position with the notion that that Black people are cursed by God, unless we have open and honest conversations and recognize that the first presidency and Quorum of the 12 disavowed that in the Race and the Priesthood essay. Right? We have to actively teach it. We have to actively teach it. We can't just go silent. I wanted to point out that in the Let's Talk About Race and Priesthood book, I say this. I do not believe the racial restrictions were of divine origins, and Deseret Book published it. It's okay, in other words, to have that position. And I think that's where the evidence is.
The whole thing just confuses me, especially when you read The Pearl of Great Price, chapter 5. The Lord said in 540, he says, I will set a mark upon Cain, lest any man finding him should kill him. The mark was a mark of protection. And so anybody who did anything against Cain after killing Abel had to answer to God. So why is it that a group of people think that this mark was to give them free reign to treat Cain or his descendant in any way? The mark was a mark of protection if you read the scripture correctly. So I have no words. It's just like, how did you come up that A plus B equals Z? I I can't even I can't fathom that, you know, and it's just beyond me. It is just beyond me, and it makes me just weep. It just makes me weep in spirit, you know.
Yeah. Thanks for
We
sharing
have to
that
do
stuff.
better, you know. And the other thing is saying that we don't know why when you use the vocabulary like that, it's worse than disemboweled. At least disembowel means you knew, but you're gonna claim you didn't know. Now you're just saying, "I don't know," but you did know. You did know the fact, okay? At least the higher ups did, you know what I'm saying? So it's just hard for me. It is. And I have no words beyond that.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. It is hard. I agree. And, you know, I love sort of the clear explanation you just offered. Brigham Young will say that the mark was black skin and a flat nose. So it is difficult to grapple with that. Those were ideas that predated the founding of the faith, and he's bringing them into the faith with him and ignoring the very scriptures that you are pointing to. Yeah. Dana, I think you had something.
No, I just adding to Stephanie, we're both in the same ward, and it's just the to say we don't know why is disturbing. I've asked missionaries in our ward for the last 18 years. Um, because we are in a predominantly Black community. If someone were to ask you about the racial restrictions, what would you say? Most of the time, their answers are, we don't know, or awkward, or they use some of the other things we've heard before, fence sitters and so forth. It's rare that somebody with confidence says that they know. And I'll point them to essay on the priesthood. Some of them have not race in the priesthood. Most had not read it. It's not out there, but it makes me think. It makes me super sad, very sad, because we're all supposed to be witnessing of Christ, and I've been thinking about this a lot lately. That Christ asked his disciples, "Who do you say that I am?" And when I have fellow Latter-day Saints saying that we don't know, leaving room for it to be of divine origin, it makes me wonder, well, who do we think Christ is? And then how does that affect who we think he is? I believe affects our worship and how we see other people. And this is about truth first and foremost. First and foremost. So Um, I struggle with that, and I just would have Latter-day Saints sit with that question that Christ asks his disciples to ask ourselves. Who do we say he is? Regardless of all the research you bring up. When I was young, I was 16 when 1978 happened, but prior to that, I was a convert when I was 9 years old, and I first learned about this from my teachers who had no problem telling me, really, this lie. Um, you know, they had been told it themselves previously, or they had learned it. And yet now, after 1978, we struggled to tell the truth. And that was slightly traumatizing to me as a child because I struggled with that. I almost left the church over it. I mean, I really wondered. And for a time, I did go inactive. Um, and it was really difficult for me. And I know it's difficult for a lot of people. So, and it still is. And I would like us all to, in unison, in choir and chorus, to say who we believe God to be and not to bear. I believe it bears false witness to ascribe this to God.
Yeah. Thank you. Another question that I sometimes ask in these conversations is just from the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says, "By their fruit ye shall know them." What are the positive fruits of the racial priesthood and temple restrictions?
A lot of damage was done.
There aren't any. There aren't any. And the other thing that we're learning, especially with the Century of Black Mormons database, is that the racial restrictions didn't work. if one drop is the policy, I'll just go back and share my screen just really briefly again. So I say this, and let's talk about race and priesthood. If one drop was a standard, we now have DNA evidence that makes it clear that there has never been a period of Latter-day Saint history without Black people admitted to the temple and ordained to the priesthood. It was a standard impossible to enforce. In other words, I've had white Latter-day Saints in the present send me emails and say, hey, we did our DNA and we have African ancestry in our DNA. And we think it traces back to ancestor X or Y. And if so, we would love them included in your database. And we do the research and we include them in the Century of Black Mormons database up through the generation where they pass as white, because there are, mixed race families. And at some point, some of these families pass as white. And then they're ordained to the priesthood and go to the temple, and they have more than one drop of African ancestry. So Century of Black Mormons traces these people up through this generation that passes white. There are literally thousands of people who fit this category, literally thousands who had African ancestry who were going to the temple and receiving the priesthood. One family that Tani Ryder for Century of Black Mormons just finished was the Harriet Church family. She was enslaved, had 10 kids, came to Utah, married her former enslaver, and they were sealed in the Salt Lake Temple. And then all of the kids are receiving priesthood and temple admission, and then they have kids, and then they have kids. And so you have generations and generations before 1978. And the best example, Jenny Pulsifer, a professor at BYU, just did the research on one of her ancestors, James Brown Jr. He's the founder of Ogden, member of the Mormon Battalion. What his family was known as colored was the language of the time in New North Carolina in a court case. And DNA evidence demonstrates that he was 1/8 African ancestry. Same as Homer Plessy in Plessy versus Ferguson. When they moved from North Carolina to Illinois, they passed as white. The knowledge of their ancestry in the community in North Carolina didn't travel with them to Illinois. That's where they convert. He is then becomes a bishop, goes to the temple in Nauvoo, part of the Mormon Battalion, founds Ogden, and the first documented person of Black African ancestry to participate in polygamy. He has 13 wives. So this is Jenny Pulsifer's conclusion to her biography of James Jr. Of James Jr.'s 28 children, 16 received temple ordinances in their lifetimes. These are people with more than one drop of African ancestry. A large number of his 209 grandchildren also received temple ordinances and priesthood ordinations during the 19th and early 20th century. James Jr.'s sister, Obedient, had 10 children, 5 endowed in their lifetimes, who produced 36 children. His brother Daniel likewise had 5 endowed children, who had 47 children. From 1839 to the present, descendants of James Jr., Obedient, and Daniel Brown have attended the temple and held the priesthood. Thousands are practicing members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints today, a resounding demonstration that people with African ancestry have always fully participated in the ordinances and offices of the church. The point I'm trying to make is racial restrictions did not work. If you're going to take all of that literally, there were thousands of people with more than one drop of African ancestry who were participating in priesthood ordination and temple admission. By their fruits ye shall know them. What are the positive fruits? And it's a policy impossible to enforce. Any other thoughts or comments?
I had one other thing that I would just like to comment on is the first time I heard you, Paul, articulate essentially what you reviewed tonight, I found it profoundly liberating that I could go back and lean on the scriptures of the restoration as the explanation for what we do and what we started out by doing, and that we simply were going back to those principles of the restoration when in 1978. And so, yeah, I just find it very liberating to be able to look at it the way that you have explained it.
Yeah, thank you, Craig. It was liberating for me too to sort of come to that conclusion after, studying the documents and the history and sort of laying it out. For me, that's the big aha. That's why I like the three divisions, right? Because 78 returns us to that original universalism. We strayed from our founding principles. And what Joseph S. Smith is saying in 1908, stop preaching to Black people, right? We read 5 verses that said, unto every creature, right? And that's when my heart breaks. One of the many times in this history that my heart breaks. It's just one of those moments where, oh man, 5 revelations and you are violating it. You're violating those revelations, right? So thanks for sharing that, Craig. I really appreciate that.
Thank you, Paul. And thank you all. And carry on.
Thank you.
Thank you.